Support for this podcast and the following message come from Allianz Travel Insurance. Barcelona's beaches, heavenly, until a jellyfish joins you for a swim. Emergency medical benefits can help take the sting out of travel challenges. Learn more at allianztravelinsurance.com.
Hey everyone, you're listening to Code Switch, the show about race and identity from NPR. I'm B.A. Parker. How was your last book club? Maybe you drank a little too much wine and argued about the latest Colson Whitehead novel, or maybe you forced your friends to watch YouTube videos. For a mom in Fort Worth, Texas, named Elizabeth Soto, she held her book club in a garage. There, she and her buddies read niche political essays, and with a standard office printer, printed out their own zines. Zines, you know, those small, self-made booklets. Elizabeth and her friends made one called Plant Propagation for the People to encourage people to plant wildflowers. They also made one called Know Your Rights to encourage people to know their rights when it comes to legally observing ICE agents. Here's how reporter Lex McMenamin describes these folks.
It is a gaggle of people who like mutual aid and gardening. It's folks that love to read.
Lex is a reporter with The Guardian. They've been following Elizabeth and a group of people who were arrested for their alleged connections to protests outside of the Prairieland ICE detention facility in Alvarado, Texas on July 4th, 2025. The majority of those protesting did so peacefully. They held a nighttime noise demonstration where they shot fireworks in solidarity with detainees. Some protesters split off and vandalized cars and broke a security camera. One protester was armed and has been convicted of shooting a police officer after the officer drew his weapon. In the year that followed, the Department of Justice brought federal charges against Elizabeth, her husband, and more than a dozen others who were allegedly connected with the protest. The crimes they were accused of range from the attempted murder of a law enforcement officer to providing material support to terrorists, a federal terrorism crime. Lex has reported that the federal government used printed protest materials, like the zines the Sotos printed, for example, as evidence to convict them of the terrorism-related charges.
In these thousands of pages of PDFs that I've gone through, it's just thousands of zines and books, more than anything else.
I spoke with Lex soon after the 3-week trial for this case against the Prairieland protesters had ended.
Champagne Song was the person sentenced to 100 years in federal prison and was found guilty of being the person to shoot this police officer.
Champagne was the only protester convicted of a violent crime. The Sotos received 50 years in prison, each. The remaining 12 defendants' sentences ranged from 22 years to 70 years, and included people who were not physically at the protest. And critics have sounded the alarm over these sentences and their severity. But that severity is intentional. Following the assassination of Charlie Kirk, President Trump signed National Security Presidential Memorandum 7. It's an executive order titled Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence. The order targets what it terms extremism on migration, race, and gender, and points to any violent conduct labeled as anti-fascist as motivated by, quote, anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, or anti-Christianity, and support to overthrow the United States government. And under the executive order, the Trump administration has classified Antifa, a decentralized, leaderless anti-fascism movement, as a domestic terrorism organization. But given its lack of formal membership, who is seen as a, quote, member of Antifa can be subject to interpretation. The case of the Prairieland protesters is the first case to be prosecuted under that executive order, and the evidence used against many of the defendants is more rooted in forms of communication than in actions. Which leads many to ask, what does the government protect as free speech? And what is it calling criminal? So that's what I'm getting into today. I talked to Guardian reporter Lex McMenamin about the case of the Prairieland protesters and what it could mean for future protesters in this country.
This message comes from Ollie. Thinking more about gut health lately? Ollie offers a range of science-backed supplements designed to support you and your family's daily wellness. From probiotics that help support digestive and immune health to fiber gummies made with kids in mind, Ollie makes it easier to build simple habits into your routine. With options for different needs and lifestyles, finding the right fit can feel more manageable. Explore the full lineup at OLLY.com.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Strawberry.me. Be honest. Are you happy with your job? Are you stuck in a job you've outgrown or never wanted in the first place? Are your reasons for staying really just excuses for not leaving? Let a career coach from Strawberry.me help you get unstuck. Discover the benefits of having a dedicated career coach in your corner and get 50% off your first coaching session at strawberry.me/NPR.
Your mornings are busy. Make the news simple. Every day on Up First, we unpack the three biggest stories of the day. This week, the final matchups of the 2026 World Cup, the latest developments between the U.S. and Iran, and a busy week in Congress with key confirmation hearings after the sudden death of Senator Lindsey Graham. Stay ahead of the news. Listen every day to Up First on the NPR app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Lex McMenamin is a reporter at The Guardian who's been covering the case of the Prairieland protesters. And Lex says this case highlights the willingness of the Trump administration to use an executive order to go after activities that have traditionally been protected under the First Amendment. And a note, we reached out to the Department of Justice for a comment and haven't heard back from them as of this recording.
This is the first big attempt at an Antifa-based terrorism conspiracy charge from the federal government. The efforts at targeting left-wing organizing, and particularly like anarchists, for example, is not novel in the United States by any means. I know I mentioned it's not a new thing for Trump. It's not new for this country. Obviously, we went through the Red Scare. We've also seen the strategy of using the federal charges and frankly, like political prosecutions against movements across this country, going from the Black Panthers and the American Indian movement, some of whom still have political prisoners to this day, serving decades-long sentences. But what is changing right now is that this is the first time in the modern era that there has been a conviction of this sort with sentences this long, focused so primarily on protected First Amendment activities, specifically zines and books. There are thousands of exhibit files of evidence that the FBI collected while raiding these people's homes, sometimes multiple times, while all of them were incarcerated. Most people got arrested within like 48 hours of this protest, some like same night. In the FBI's raids of these people's homes, the vast majority of what they took was not, plans to ambush an ICE facility or attack an officer. Many of the defendants did legally own guns, which I will reiterate, this case was in Texas. That is an extremely common thing to have legally carried guns in the household. But that stuff really wasn't the bulk of what's in the exhibit files. In these thousands of pages of PDFs that I've gone through, which took forever, it's just thousands of zines and books, more than anything else.
Zines of what?
I wish we were doing video because I have been bringing some of them around with me, my clandestine materials,
Wait, do you have some zines with
I can
you?
show Parker. One of the zines that I've talked a lot about, in part because I was able to interview the author of the zine. Like, for folks who don't look at zines very often, they're mostly anonymous. They're usually, like, not even for sale. A lot of them are meant to be, like, PDFs you yourself can print online.
I went to the Black Girl Zine convention last month. I understand.
Exactly. Sorry, that was just for the folks at home, because I didn't realize some people didn't know what zines were, and now I've had to, like, kind of backtrack on that. So I'm going to hand my pile over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to look at these really quickly.
Exhibit files.
All right. So this is like a folded piece of paper that's folded into like
a little
booklet.
Yeah.
That says Nonviolent Direct Action Training Guide. Notes from 2014 Boston NVDA training hosted by a lot of names.
Yeah, so that's just like if you open it, it's very basic information about how to protect yourself at a protest that might get, as organizers might call it, like spicy. Like maybe there's like law enforcement present, like maybe it's an action where you sit down and block the road, which again, super common protest strategy.
It's like, deep abiding love, what you will lose tenure for, stand in front of a tank for, get arrested for. Nonviolent direct action is decentralized but disciplined. Preparing for like tear gas and pepper spray, remain calm, chemical agent.
Yeah.
Some of this is like things, frankly, that I was taught in hostile environment training.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the materials are basic information on how to protect yourself of that kind, and that was categorized as evidence that these folks had the intention of doing violent acts, and that's what they were preparing for with those materials.
On the very back, it says, do not engage police. Do not escalate. Think of your actions individually and collectively as a sound bite. How will it be perceived and received?
Right. And all I can think about is this particular zine, which, again, is just like one of countless that are in the materials that came out 12 years before this incident or whatever.
Yeah.
And has a lot. The sound bites thing is so resonant to what these folks are going through,
Yeah. So there's the zine part of this case, but then there's also another example that really stood out to me that involves the messaging app Signal. Now, can you tell me about that case?
Yeah, I think most listeners will know what Signal is. It is an encrypted messaging app that's independently owned, as in it's not owned by any of the big tech conglomerates that I think people have seen grow closer to the Trump administration since he retook office. The other thing that's worth noting about Signal is that organizers have used this app for like a decade. It is not a new thing. And as you were saying, like, it's very common to be told in environments where you're being trained around potentially surveilled activities to, use Signal, don't use your real name, like make sure you're hard to find on there.
These are all safeguarding measures.
Exactly. And people, like one of the defendants in this case mentioned to me, like, yeah, my neighbor uses Signal simply because she, like a lot of people that lives in Texas, just doesn't like the government and doesn't like surveillance, but all she's texting about is like who's coming home for dinner. Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so like it has become extremely common to use. And I'll also say, like, with the rise of the No Kings movement and also like how in the streets people have been doing ICE observing, Signal has become really pivotal for a lot of these people in order to do this organizing and feel safe while doing it. Mm-hmm. The government is categorizing using Signal in and of itself as proof of nefariousness and attempting to evade capture by law enforcement, and characterizes some of the messages within these group chats as inherently suspect. The fact that people use pseudonyms on Signal was seen as evidence of conspiracy. And then, we're now seeing Signal chats, for example, being used in the recent indictment against 15 people in Minneapolis over their anti-ICE organizing in January. Like, if you look at the indictment, it literally lists the defendants and then AKA Signal pseudonym, AKA other Signal pseudonym, because they're actually like coming after the usage of Signal itself and the use of encrypted messaging apps for anonymity's purposes in and of itself, like a conspiracy against the government. Mind you, Pete Hegseth, girl, exactly.
Didn't Pete Hegseth and the administration have their own Signal controversy as of like 2025?
Literally a year ago, but also like clearly their use of quote unquote OPSEC, it was not quite as effective as some organizers' usage. So I don't know, like,
but it makes me wonder, like, so how safe is it to use Signal then?
Yeah, I will say, Signal has been very, I think, organizationally committed to not cooperating with the government when possible. Mm-hmm. And part of how the government got access to some of the Signal chats in this case was actually through an insecurity in Apple phones in which they were able to, even if they had self-erasing messages, automatically deleting messages set up on a chat, which a lot of them did, which is a very common practice for organizers. If you had your phone set up so that like pop-up notifications actually said the contents of the message when it came in on your phone, the government could access those old pop-up notifications. And so that's part of how they were going through the chats for the deleted messages. Apple patched that insecurity.
So to put this into broader context, how has the term domestic terrorism, as defined in the executive order used to prosecute these defendants, shaped this case and sentencing?
Yeah. I think the Prairieland case shows that a lot of how they're characterizing quote-unquote terrorism is simply in holding political stances and values that are counter to what the Trump administration wants to be de facto. And I think that a lot of how they were able to do this is because, a cop was shot and they took that and ran. But the evidence for the Prairieland case is so completely based in rhetoric and literature rather than actual evidence of crimes, And so the way that they framed this conspiracy of quote unquote terrorism by hosting a very common form of nonviolent protest for the most part and having the cops called on them outside of an ICE facility was really not. They were able to characterize this as this very violent action because they put all of the focus on this cop being shot, which is quite serious, obviously, but was not the bulk of what they accused these people of doing. They accused them of hosting a leftist book club and therefore fomenting anti-American ideology in and of itself. So it does feel very thought crime based.
Coming up,
I think a lot of people saw 30 years for a box of zines and then all of the January 6th people having been pardoned and were really outraged.
That's coming up. Stay with us.
This message comes from Grainger. This is the story of the one. As a procurement manager for a hospital system, she keeps every facility in her network stocked and ready. That's why she counts on Grainger to be her single source for thousands of products, from disinfectants to lighting, air filters, and more. And with fast, dependable delivery, Grainger helps her keep every facility stocked, safe, and running smoothly. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
This message comes from Instacart. Instacart knows not all bananas are created equal. Some want them green, some ripe, some want them ready right now. With Instacart's Preference Picker, available at most retailers, you can choose preferences like avocado ripeness or deli thickness before your shopper starts. So instead of hoping for the best, you get groceries picked the way you would pick them. Download the app and get bananas just how you like with Instacart.
Every story from Shortwave NPR Science Podcast starts with a question. Like, why do we have nightmares? How does AI affect my energy bill? At NPR, we are here for your right to be curious about the world around you. Follow Shortwave wherever you get your podcasts, because the more you ask, the more interesting the world gets.
Parker, just Parker, code switch. I'm talking to reporter Lex McMenamin about the Prairieland case in Texas and how it's the first case against protesters to be prosecuted under President Trump's National Security Presidential Memo 7. So I have to ask, so the memo came out because of Charlie Kirk's assassination and identified the, quote, shooter's ideology as encouraging more political violence. And what we know is that the shooter was, romantically involved with a trans individual and pointed to anti-trans rhetoric in their justification for killing Kirk. Knowing all that, and we know that the Prairieland cases, Champagne Strong and the two other trans women are being sentenced to 50 to 100 years and are all being held in men's facilities. Mm-hmm. And I just recently reported on the surge of anti-trans legislation throughout the country. How much influence does the national pushback against trans folk have on how these defendants have been treated?
I'll just mention for context for listeners, I am trans, I'm trans, masculine, non-binary. And I do think I am possibly the only national reporter who has gone and visited these defendants in jail or prison, which I hope to be corrected otherwise at some point in the coverage rollout of this story. And I think whether or not the Trump administration is intentionally dragnetting trans people into these conspiracy cases, which I from my own count, I'm pretty sure like just under a third of the defendants of the 22 Prairieland defendants are trans, but that's a pretty big chunk. And then there was another case that was similar in Spokane where 3 people were found guilty. This was after Prairieland, with Prairieland as precedent to that. 2/3 of them were trans. So I think we're seeing a lot of trans representation in the defendants in these conspiracy cases against left-wing people, which is not surprising to me because trans people are often really active in community organizing and protest movements, regardless of the issue, because they're so used to protesting. Because as you're saying, like, their rights are constantly contested. And in this country, they've been quite publicly under attack, especially for the last 6 years. And so the treatment of the trans defendants in this case, as you mentioned, 2 of the defendants are out trans women. Their names are Megan Morris and Autumn Hill. Both have been dead named in all of the federal government's filings around this case. They have also been misgendered by the federal government. As you noted, they're being held in men's facilities, which is like actually against existing federal standing as established by the judiciary. Like, the federal government is not supposed to be moving trans women into men's facilities. And civil rights and trans rights experts feel very strongly that there is an extreme safety risk for trans women being held in men's facilities. There are really high rates of sexual violence against trans women in men's facilities. For a period in the first facility, which is a jail. The first place these folks, all of the defendants, were detained was in a jail in Johnson County, which is where the facility Prairieland is based. At least one of the trans women defendants, Megan Morris, was denied access to her hormones while she was being held in Johnson County, which is also a violation of her civil rights, but also for folks that don't know, some trans people who have medically transitioned no longer have the ability to produce their own hormones naturally. And had she not regained access to HRT, she actually could have been really experiencing a health risk. And the government, nonetheless, she was denied access to her hormones for a period. So I think there is a lot to be said about how being trans and incarcerated in this country right now means that your civil rights, which are already quite contested, seemingly go right out the window. And these folks have all been held. Their bails last year were set at $5 to $10 million. So there was they've all been detained since being arrested. No one has been let out besides there's only one defendant who's out on bond, and he is only facing state charges. So, I think you can't see that there's such a big chunk of these defendants that are trans and that are not being treated in accordance with their gender identities in the incarceration process for this case, and not acknowledge that there's an element of transphobia, whether or not it's intentional or explicit in the development of the cases.
I've seen critics who've watched the Prairieland case unfold compare the way the Trump administration treated the defendants in that case to the way President Trump pardoned all the January 6th rioters, even those accused of the most violent crimes of that day. What are the differences here?
For starters, in the context of the January 6th riots, we know that at least one law enforcement officer died due to his injuries following the events of that day.
Right. And 2 other officers died by suicide in the days immediately after January 6th. The DOJ classified their deaths as in the line of duty.
Yeah, the police officer in the Prairieland case survived and went back to work. So this is a situation. Prairieland is a case in which no one died. As far as I can tell, the longest conviction or the longest sentence anyone got in relation to January 6th was 22 years, which is still 8 years shorter than the shortest conviction in the Prairieland case, which was for a defendant who was not present at the protest period. He got picked up for driving a box of zines from his apartment to what was meant to be a secondary location, but he was actually pulled over by the police on the way and has not been released from jail since that moment. 2 days after the protest in question. And so I think a lot of people saw 30 years for a box of zines and then all of the January 6th people having been pardoned and were really outraged. Before sentencing, when I would bring this case up to people, they had never even heard of it, had no idea what I was talking about. They would respond and be like, wow, that's crazy, but I'm not seeing any coverage. But then when the sentences came down last week, I think people immediately clicked and connected it to January 6th and the way that Trump has pardoned all of those folks out, attempted to create like a slush fund effectively for some of those people who have since been released. Meanwhile, the sentencing in this case is harsher by multiples than what the sentences they got for January 6th.
All right, so Lex, what happens now? Like, what happens to the people who have been prosecuted, who have been convicted? Like, will there be an appeal?
Yeah, so the defense attorneys for the convicted Prairieland defendants announced their intentions to appeal immediately following the end of the trial, which they weren't able to begin those appeals until after sentencing. So that would be now. The case is appealed to the Fifth Circuit, which is known as a quite conservative court. And so if it does not go sympathetically to them in the Fifth Circuit, the next appellate court would be the Supreme Court, which all of this takes time also. The appeals process is quite lengthy. And so there's a very good chance that none of this would even progress to SCOTUS, for example, before the next presidential administration. And so a lot of the folks in this case are not really anticipating support from the legal system to get out of this situation at all, though they do remain steadfast in saying that they are not guilty of what the government has charged them with. Ironically, the best case scenarios for them appears to be presidential pardons under a future administration.
So you've been covering protests and movements for a while. What does the aggressive nature of these sentences signal to you as the future of protesting? Or about the ways that the United States is quelling dissent?
We're in the context of the 250th anniversary of this country, and a lot of the legal experts I spoke to for this story noted that the Federalist Papers were essentially an anonymous zine. The founding of this country comes from a belief in free speech that is meant not only politically, but through an effort to communicate with one another, even if that communication is quote unquote anti-establishment or explicitly anti-government administration of whoever's in power, right? And so this case, I think, speaks to what a lot of people feel is the almost immeasurable chasm between how America talks about itself and how it actually treats its citizens. If those citizens say something that is counter to whoever is in power in that exact moment in time. But I think what's also an American story is people continuing to do this anyway in the face of really stark repression. As I noted earlier, this is not novel for left-wing activists to really bear the brunt of the state as a fully ideological attack. And nonetheless, I think people have continued organizing against this, even in the ways that the government has categorized as being possible for criminalization, particularly in the creation of zines. I also brought zines today for Parker to see of all the zines the support committee around this case has made to tell people about who these defendants are, like include pictures of them, talk about their pets and like the ways that they live their lives and their passions outside of this case. And just in the week since the sentences dropped, the outcry around this case and the commitment of people who make zines, people who do this type of organizing to stand in solidarity with these defendants has really multiplied sort of incredibly, to think about like how few people even knew what this was before last week. Someone's already made my article into a zine.
Really?
Yeah. And it's like, I just think there's something so important in witnessing people see the government go after these things and then go, okay, well, we're going to do it even harder. And you can't come after all of us. And even if you try, you can't stop us from supporting one another. You can't stop people on the outside from trying to organize to get these people free. Or you can try, but people are going to do it anyway. And so I think I'm going to continue watching these conspiracy cases. I think people are really trying to get organized to prepare themselves to have a strong legal argument and response, since a lot of the Trump administration's attempts at prosecuting protesters in the last year and a half have not worked. Prairieland is a big exception to that. But I also think there's a lot to be made of how people are really resisting the framing of this case and choosing instead to continue engaging in First Amendment protected activity, given the stakes of this moment that they see.
Lex, thank you so much.
Thank you, as always, for having me.
We reached out to the Federal Bureau of Prisons about Megan Morris and Autumn Hill being held in men's facilities. They said since neither one of them is currently in federal custody, the Bureau cannot comment on their whereabouts. We did find both Megan and Autumn in the Johnson County Prison Database, where they are listed under their birth names and their sex is listed as male. And that's our show. And just a reminder that we have a great newsletter. Subscribe to the Code Switch newsletter by going to npr.org/codeswitchnewsletter. This episode was produced by Xavier Lopez. It was edited by Dahlia Mortada. Our engineer was An-Li Huang. And a big shout out to the rest of the Code Switch massive. Christina Kala, Jess Kung, Leah Dinella, Courtney Stein, Maya Dangerfield, Barton Girdwood, Yolanda Sanguini, and Jean Demby. I'm B.A. Parker. Hydrate.
This message comes from MIDI Health. CEO Joanna Strober shares the personal experience that led her to start a virtual care platform for women in perimenopause and menopause.
I was having anxiety, I had gained weight, I wasn't sleeping, and my primary care doctor never once said that perhaps I was in perimenopause and that all these things could be related to my hormones. So I had a really tough time for quite a while, and a friend recommended that I try a concierge doctor. She prescribed hormones for me, a combination of estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. And I felt very relieved that I had this care, and I also had a lot of sadness that I had spent such a long period of time going through this and not getting the right care. And so essentially what we really want to do at MIDI is democratize access to this type of care.
MIDI Health, committed to helping women in midlife with perimenopause and menopause care, accessible via telehealth visits at joinmidi.com.